Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Echoes of Oceanview Manor. The small town of Everwood was tucked far enough from bustling city life to feel like another era. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where stories whispered in the streets and secrets lingered in old houses. For Grace Warren and her family, moving to Oceanview Manor promised a fresh start away from the stresses of city living. But as they pulled up the winding road to the house, Grace couldn't ignore the prickling feeling along her skin, as if the house were watching them arrive. Oceanview Manor loomed at the end of a narrow drive, its faded white exterior hidden behind overgrown trees and tangled vines. Grace stepped out of the car, her eyes tracing the contours of the house. Despite the crisp fall air, a strange dampness seemed to settle around them. James, her husband, stretched, exhaling with the confidence of a man about to embark on a grand project. He turned to her, grinning. "It just needs a little love," he said, more to himself than to her. Their two children, Ethan and Lily, wasted no time racing toward the house, their laughter echoing against the silence. Grace forced a smile, hoping her unease was just nerves. After all, the house was a steal, a grand old place sold well below market value. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the house, with its creaking porch and darkened windows, was hiding something. That night, after a long day of unpacking, Grace wandered through the house, observing the way the rooms seemed to shift in the evening light. There was an odd quietness about it, an absence of the comforting hum of a lived-in home. Oceanview Manor was vast, with narrow hallways and rooms that seemed to lead into each other in strange ways. Every footstep seemed to echo, and every turn revealed another corner cloaked in shadows. The family's rooms were scattered around the second floor, with Grace and James's bedroom at the end of the hall. As she tucked the children into bed, she noticed Ethan staring at the ceiling, his brow furrowed. "Mom, I heard someone walking outside my room last night," he said. Grace's chest tightened, but she brushed his comment aside with a reassuring smile. "It's an old house, sweetheart. Old houses creak and groan. You'll get used to it." She kissed him goodnight and left the room, but his words lingered with her. That night, as she lay beside James, she thought she heard faint footsteps too, soft, almost cautious, as if someone were moving through the house with careful intention. The basement door was stuck when they first arrived, and James took it upon himself to open it on the third day. With a crowbar and a few grunts, he managed to pry the door open, releasing a musty, stagnant smell that filled the hallway. "Grace, I'm going down there," he called, his voice echoing through the house. Grace followed him, standing at the top of the stairs as he descended into the darkness below. The basement was damp and cluttered, filled with forgotten boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. James's flashlight cast strange shadows on the walls, and Grace felt an involuntary shiver as she watched him disappear into the dark corners. "Find anything?" she called down, but her voice came out softer than she'd intended. "Just junk," James replied, though he sounded oddly distracted. He returned with a small, tarnished key he'd found wedged between the stones in one corner. Grace held it, feeling its weight and the strange warmth it seemed to carry. "I'll keep it," she said, pocketing it, though she wasn't sure why. On the fourth day, Grace decided to visit their nearest neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson who lived a mile down the road. She was a reserved woman, but when Grace mentioned Oceanview Manor, Mrs. Thompson's eyes darkened. "That house." Mrs. Thompson's voice trailed off. She seemed to hesitate before continuing. "I remember the Fraser family. Quiet folk kept to themselves, until the night they all vanished." Grace felt a chill. "Vanished?" Mrs. Thompson nodded, looking as though she regretted saying anything. "People say the house has a history. Bad energy, maybe. Folks around here don't talk about it much, but some say it remembers things." Grace thanked her politely, but her mind was racing as she walked back to Oceanview Manor. She told herself it was just an old woman's superstition, but a part of her wondered if Mrs. Thompson had seen something she couldn't explain. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Doors that were closed would be found open, and objects would disappear, only to reappear in odd places. Grace tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the chaos of moving, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. One night, as she was washing dishes, she felt a cold gust brush past her neck, and a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, seemed to reach her ears. She turned, but the kitchen was empty. James entered a moment later, laughing at something the kids had said, and the strange feeling dissipated. But Grace felt unsettled, as though something unseen was lingering just out of sight. One evening, Grace came across a small, locked door at the end of the hallway on the second floor. She'd never noticed it before and was surprised to find it locked. She tried the key James had found in the basement, and to her surprise, it fit. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dusty room that looked untouched for years. Inside was a single chair, facing the window. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and Grace felt a sudden urge to leave. She backed out of the room and locked the door behind her, deciding not to mention it to James. But that night, she dreamed of the room, of someone sitting in that chair, watching the road outside with a silent, patient intensity. One night, Ethan came to Grace, saying his room felt strangely cold. She followed him back, stepping into his room and feeling an odd drop in temperature, a stark contrast to the warmth in the rest of the house. "Do you feel it too, Mom?" Ethan whispered, clutching her hand. Grace nodded, her heart pounding. She tried to reassure him, but her voice felt thin, insincere. "It's just an old house, honey. Old houses can be drafty." But deep down, she couldn't ignore the sensation of something lurking, a presence that seemed to seep through the walls, hiding just beneath the surface. Desperate for peace of mind, Grace called Father Brennan, the local priest, to bless the house. Father Brennan arrived on a bright Saturday morning, his expression calm but serious as he moved through the rooms, sprinkling holy water and muttering prayers. When he reached the top of the stairs leading to the attic, he paused, his face tightening. "There's something here," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Grace's heart raced as he looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet warning. "Sometimes places carry memories," he said carefully, "but there's always a way to make peace with them." He finished the blessing and left, declining her invitation to stay for tea. As she watched him walk away, Grace felt a weight lift, but a lingering unease remained, as though the house had merely quieted, waiting. Days passed, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The silence of the house had changed. It was no longer an absence of sound, but rather a charged stillness that wrapped around her, waiting. One morning, as she peeled back the aging wallpaper in the hallway, she noticed something unusual etched into the wood beneath. A small symbol, almost faded beyond recognition. She traced her fingers over it, feeling the rough lines gouged deep into the wood. Her thoughts raced back to Father Brennan's words. Places carry memories. Was this one of those memories? Unease settled in her stomach, but she pushed it down, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks. Yet, over the next few days, she found more of these strange carvings. Beneath window frames, inside closets, and on the underside of her dresser drawer. Each one seemed to pull her deeper into the house's secrets, like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't meant to solve. It was past midnight when Grace was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Beside her, James was fast asleep. She moved carefully out of bed, not wanting to wake him, and followed the soft padding of feet. Her heart froze as she saw Ethan standing in the hallway, just a few feet from the small locked room. His eyes were wide open, but they held a glassy, vacant look. He was staring straight at the door, as if entranced. "Ethan?" she whispered, stepping closer, but he didn't respond. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, and he blinked, as if breaking free from a trance. "Mom?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Why am I here? You were sleepwalking, honey, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Come on, let's get you back to bed. As she led him back to his room, she couldn't shake the image of him standing so eerily still, eyes fixated on the locked door. She waited by his bedside until his breathing softened, then quietly left the room. But sleep eluded her that night, her mind replaying the haunting scene in the hallway. Determined to get to the bottom of the house's mysteries, Grace visited the Everwood Library the next day. The librarian, a friendly woman with keen eyes, listened intently as Grace explained her interest in Oceanview Manor. After some searching, the librarian brought her a stack of newspaper clippings and photographs. Grace sifted through them, her heart pounding as she uncovered stories of the Fraser family, who had lived in the manor decades ago. Among the faded photos was one of a little boy, his eyes wide and curious, bearing an uncanny resemblance to Ethan. A chill ran through her as she traced the boy's face with her finger, her mind racing with questions. Had the boy once stood in the same hallway, stared at the same locked door? She had no answers, only the gnawing fear that her family's presence here was part of a larger, darker story they were just beginning to uncover. That evening, Grace tried to share her discoveries with James, showing him the photographs and recounting Ethan's sleepwalking episode. But James merely shook his head, his brows furrowing. Grace, this is an old house. It's creaky, and sure it has a history, but you're letting your imagination get the best of you. She felt a sharp stab of frustration. James, our son was standing in front of that door in the middle of the night. Doesn't that unsettle you at all? He sighed, rubbing his forehead. Look, I understand you're worried, but this is too much, Grace. You're scaring yourself. As he walked away, she felt the weight of his dismissal. She was on her own in unraveling the mysteries of Oceanview Manor, and as the shadows grew longer, she sensed that whatever secrets the house held, they were not meant to stay buried. Grace's hands shook as she set the dusty letters down on the kitchen table, their contents buzzing in her mind. She hadn't planned on telling James right away, but the words from the Fraser family's letters echoed through her head. She knew she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. James, I found something disturbing, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his coffee, eyes weary. Grace, not this again. We've talked about this house. It's just old, nothing more. She pulled out one of the letters, pressing it into his hands. Please read this. It's from the Fraser family. They went through the same things we are. Cold spots, strange noises. Their son, too, Her voice cracked as she mentioned Ethan. James glanced down at the letter, eyes scanning the page. The deeper he read, the more his face changed, softening with concern. They lived here. They lost their child, she whispered. James, we need to get Ethan out of here. Silence fell between them, heavy and palpable, as the weight of her words settled in. Finally, James nodded, his eyes troubled. Driven by a renewed determination, Grace set out to find any remaining documents or artifacts connected to the manor. After days of searching, she discovered a hidden compartment in the storage shed, containing a weathered journal and more letters. The journal belonged to the architect himself, detailing his original intentions for the house. As she read, her heart sank. The architect wrote of his belief that darkness had to be contained. He had designed the house with protective symbols, meant to shield the occupants. But the journal hinted at fears that the symbols didn't protect. It was as if they had unintentionally trapped something within the walls. The weight of this revelation sat heavy with her. Each letter, each symbol, and every carving she'd uncovered all pointed to the same horrifying truth. This place wasn't a haven. It was a prison for something they couldn't see, something that seemed to be taking its toll on Ethan. One morning, Grace noticed Ethan's face was flushed, his skin damp with sweat. She rushed to his side, alarmed. Ethan, honey, are you all right? He looked up, his eyes glassy and distant, as if he weren't really seeing her. Mom, he whispered. Why are they sad? A chill ran down her spine. Who, Ethan? Who's sad? They said they're sad because they can't leave, he murmured, slipping back into a feverish sleep. Panic rose within her. She'd heard of fever dreams, of children's vivid imaginations. But there was something about his words, his tone, that felt all too real. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to get them out. As Grace pored over the architect's journal, a horrifying realization set in. The house had been crafted as a fortress, not to protect its inhabitants, but to keep whatever was inside from escaping. The strange symbols, the recurring tragedies, the unexplained behaviors, they all began to connect in her mind like pieces of a twisted puzzle. Her fear for Ethan grew, but as she shared her findings with James, he finally understood. They couldn't stay in Oceanview Manor any longer. The risk was too great, the cost too high. With James on board, they made a plan. By daybreak, they would pack their essentials, leave the rest behind if they had to, and escape to safety. The house was quiet as they made preparations, but Grace felt a sense of tension, as if the walls themselves were watching. She tried to keep calm, but her pulse raced. As they packed, she noticed Ethan watching her, his face pale. "Are we leaving, Mom?" he asked. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going somewhere safe." On their final night, an overwhelming chill settled throughout the house, heavier than ever before. As they hurried to pack, Grace heard faint whispers echoing through the halls, almost pleading. She took Ethan by the hand, urging him toward the door. Just as they reached the front entry, the lights flickered, and she felt a gust of icy air rush past. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching toward them. Fighting her fear, she pushed the door open and pulled Ethan through, followed by James. As they stumbled onto the lawn, the house seemed to exhale, the lights dimming behind them. They drove off, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. Grace felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, leaving behind the chilling memories they'd endured. But as the house faded from sight, she felt an unshakable sense that some mysteries were never meant to be solved.